Hi, I'm Dave. I'm a designer and design educator, and I'm speaking to you from the University of Idaho. I'm an assistant professor of art and design, and I teach interaction design for mobile devices and experiential design for the built environment. My research focus is theme parks, and that was the topic of my MFA thesis entitled Themerica. My presentation today is Liking the Guests, Disney Theme Parks and the Origins of Human-Centered Experiential Design. So why talk about Disney parks at this Design Education Summit? Well, the focus this year is on human-centered design. And I'd like to put forward that Walt Disney was a pioneer, human-centered experiential designer. And there are many lessons we can learn from his work at Disneyland and the work the company has continued in the decades since at its parks all over the world. So just a little terminology first. Again, I teach interaction design for mobile devices. There's two terms that we frequently use: UI design and UX design. UI stands for user interface and UX for user experience. So UI designers work on how an experience is visually arranged and laid out. And UX designers work on how that experience feels and functions. I mention this because Disneyland was developed like an app, really. Version 1.0 opened in 1955, and it's been prototyped, iterated, tested, and revised to this day. Disney's other Magic Kingdom style parks are all versions of the first one. The second park opened in Florida in 1971, followed in Japan, France, Hong Kong, and the most recent iteration, Shanghai. So each of these iterations is an improved adaptation in a series of human-centered experiences. Which humans? In experiential design, we don't talk about a consumer or a client or even a customer. We talk about the user, the visitor, and the guest. User is the technology term, so computer and device users. Visitor is the term that museums and cultural institutions use. And guest is used in the hospitality and entertainment sectors. Disney elevated the human-centered experience to the status of guest. And using what? Using what I call thematic design, an immersive, interactive, and seamless blend of story and space within the built environment. So looking at our friend Mickey here, this transforms into a useful Venn diagram of the three primary disciplines: graphic design, interior design, and last of all, architecture and landscape architecture. So this is a cinematic experience wrapped in filmic grammar. So starting with Walt, the Disney parks are experiential, as I said, and Walt was very direct about this. Here's John Hench, longtime Disney designer with Walt. John Hench says, Walt wanted to simply step from motion pictures into another kind of reality, to do something that people could experience. He was a firm believer in experience. He said that experiences were the only thing that you really own. They were yours. And Walt built the prototype for this experience in his backyard, just like a wireframe. The Carrollwood Pacific was a scale model railroad. Here he is riding the locomotive named after his wife, the Lily Bell. There was a tunnel that was a dark ride experience, which would later be repeated at dozens of Disneyland attractions. The Carrollwood grounds became their own world. This was Walt's prototype theme park before Disneyland. The house, the yard, railroad attractions, gardens, landscaping, a unified experience in aesthetic and theme. The first Mickey Mouse Park concept was to be built adjacent to the Disney studio. As you can see, it's just a larger version of Walt's Railroad. His dreams grew. Eventually, they chose a site in Orange County, south of LA, and they went through many iterations of the preliminary scheme, all the way to the final layout, which took sort of a triangular diamond orientation. And there's the final park in its opening year. Walt's concept for his Disneyland park was a human-centered design in two key ways, okay? The first, it was a response to amusement parks like Coney Island that were not family-friendly. They were rowdy places, there was a lot of alcohol, and there weren't a lot of rides and attractions that families could ride together. So Disneyland was Walt's response to these parks not meeting people's true needs. Secondly, architects couldn't deliver the kind of experiences Walt wanted to provide. He retained a firm, didn't like their master plan, it didn't meet with his vision. And his neighbor and friend, architect Welton Beckett, said, Walt, you need to hire your own movie people. So Disneyland was Walt's response to architects not meeting people's true needs. After Disneyland opened, Walt became a usability engineer. And I say this, he remained one until the day he died. Again, the Disney parks are human-centered, and Walt's term for this was liking the guests. He often wandered the park without an escort, mingling, mixing in with the crowd, constantly chatting with guests, usually asking questions of children. Every morning, he toured the grounds before the park would open. Now, obviously, some of these photos are staged with a company photographer, but he did do this every single morning. During the day, he would linger, and for the first few years, he was not recognized very much. Always deeply involved when work was going on. And critical and questioning. Here he's showing some press run. You can see that look on his face. He's pointing to something and commenting about it. Walt was a stickler for quality, insisting people noticed. A story that John Hench liked to tell is when they were designing the stagecoach ride at Disneyland, Walt insisted upon a very expensive and authentic form of leather for the hand straps. And John Hench said, "I don't think anyone's going to notice." And he says that Walt protested vigorously and said, "They will feel good about it. They will understand it was done for them. If you do something, people don't respond to it, it's because you're a poor communicator. But if you really reach them and touch them, they will respond." This attention to detail was Walt's way of liking the guests. He observed guest behavior and made changes to Disneyland accordingly. If you've seen one of these before, a trod path through a lawn, this is called a desire path. It's a trail carved out by repeated use. And today, many university campuses actually pave these paths as they accumulate. Walt was an early adopter of this process. John Hench tells the story that shortly after the park opened, gardeners came up to Walt and said, "We need a fence to keep guests out of the flower bed," where they were carving a path. And John Hench says, Walt told them, "No, we must pave this pathway. When guests make their own path, they probably have a damn good reason for doing it." This accommodation, again, was Walt liking the guests. You can see this gentleman here in a hat who's walking across the lawn. That area would be paved a year later. Walt tested everything as a guest and demanded that all his designers do the same. Betty Taylor, an entertainer at the park, tells a story that shortly before the Swiss Family Robinson Treehouse opened, she caught Walt walking up and down the steps and testing the ropes and the railings. She said he always tried out things before opening them to the public. This empathy, again, was Walt liking the guests. So, after Walt Disney passed away in 1966. Other leaders in the company took up the mantle. Marty Sklar, 53 years at Disney, head of Walt Disney Imagineering for 2.5 decades. In 1987, he gave a talk at the American Association of Museums annual meeting, Education versus Entertainment, Competing for Audiences. And this is where he debuted what he calls Mickey's 10 Commandments. He later expanded these in a book after he retired called One Little Spark, which I highly recommend. So I'd like to elaborate on 3 of these with the time we have. 2 from the UI or the interface perspective, organize the flow of people and ideas and create a weenie. And 1 from the UX or experience perspective, know your audience. So from the UI perspective, organize the flow of people and ideas. Marty says, make sure there's a logic and sequence in your stories and in the way guests experience them. And the example is the hub. So Disneyland is a sequence of settings and images composed of wide, medium, and close shots, just like a film. The entrance plaza is a theater lobby. You can see Walt standing here with the coming attractions posters, just like you'd have at a movie house. Guests enter through one of 2 tunnels under the railroad tracks and walk down a central corridor of Main Street, USA. The park has only a single entrance and exit. And at the end of Main Street in the center is the hub. So by Davis's third scheme, the wheel and spoke element is in the center of the plan. Now, Disney didn't invent this, right? Such radial design is very common in urban planning. On the final Disneyland site plan, Davis labels the central element hub. Here you can see the final landscape plan by Ruth Schellhorn and the satellite view today. The hub not only negotiates space, though, it's experiential design because it parses content. Now you have to remember, television was the Google, the Facebook, the Instagram, and the Twitter of the 50s, all in one. And Walt was before his time. He started on a TV show called Disneyland to sell his park nationwide. A year before it opened, he was on television. And Disneyland was branded before it was even built. The show was divided into the same narratives as the theme lands at the park, and guests navigate the park's narratives just like a television set. So the hub is like turning a knob and literally changing channels in Disneyland. Taking the Adventureland show, Jungle Safari, or change channels to Frontierland and experience a Western, or Tomorrowland and experience science fiction. To choose a new narrative, one always had to return back to the hub. So this was a convenient place to meet if someone in your party got separated. Disneyland was designed as a mediated environment, literally a television dial in space. Now, over the years, Disneyland's hub has evolved. And again, thinking in terms of an app, the entrance to the park is like creating an account or logging in. Main Street, the central corridor, is like an onboarding, which gets you to what we call the hamburger menu. From there, you can choose a user flow within the app. Now, at first, you always had to return to the hub, just like early versions of mobile apps. But over time, the park was redesigned around this. Just like a successful app doesn't require you to return to the menu every time to change functions. So the layout of the park is more flexible and responsive now. The UI is better. So here's Disneyland 1.0. Now all Disney parks have an open and flexible layout. Here's Magic Kingdom v2.0. It's far larger than Disneyland as its hub, but it's still the central element. Yet the park was designed to be flexible and fluid from the start without having to return to the hub. And there are many more walkways throughout inspired by the Desire Pass at Disneyland. The hub still facilitates but does not constrain. And you can see it evolve here from Tokyo through Paris, Hong Kong to Shanghai. So the second UI point, create a weenie, a visual magnet. Marty says create visual targets that lead visitors clearly and logically through the experience you've built. So castles, mountains, towers, and trees. The Disney family dog, Dee Dee, very beloved, and cocktail weenies that Walt would hold out as a treat to beckon Dee Dee. So a weenie is the term he used for a visual magnet that draws visitors in. Now from the parking lot, they first see the train station. That's that first magnet. Then they're drawn down Main Street, closer and closer to the castle, the primary visual magnet. Now looking to the west, visitors in 1955 would see the smokestacks of the Mark Twain Riverboat. Looking to the right, the Rocket to the Moon ride. Curiously, Adventureland had an entry sign but no weenie, and this was intentional. Walt and his designers wanted to feel more exotic and mysterious. And there are other types of these targets at all the Disney parks. Here's Spaceship Earth at Epcot, Twilight Zone Tower of Terror, the Tree of Life at Animal Kingdom, Mount Prometheus and Tokyo's Disney Sea. Even the Disney water parks have these visual magnets. So the big takeaway here, human-centered design should be orderly and self-evident by using a strong operating metaphor. It should make sense at a glance. Now for user experience, this is my final point, know your audience. Marty says identify the prime audience for your attraction or show before you begin your design. So let's look at cultural adaptation around the world. So the first park to open abroad was in Japan. It's interesting, the castle is a one-to-one replica of Florida. And the attractions are kind of a greatest hits selection between Disneyland and the Florida park. The Japanese have no reference for small-town Americana. So instead they have this generically Victorian glass structure called World Bazaar. And the Japanese aren't familiar with the concept of frontier, a wide open space, being a small island nation, but they love Westerns. So this is Westernland. The Paris park opened in 1992, and I believe it's the most beautiful and elegant of all the Magic Kingdom parks. Disney really had a challenge though. I mean, how do you compete? Europe has plenty of real castles, so they dialed up the storybook fantasy design. And the park draws visitors from all over Europe, and they have their own cultures and expectations. So Disney dialed up the national identities. So Jack and the Beanstalk, this is the English part of the park. Sleeping Beauty for the French part. Pinocchio for the Italian part. And the two largest groups who visit are the French, of course, and the British. So instead of Tomorrowland, there's a steampunk tribute to the visionary science fiction of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. After that, Hong Kong opened in 2005. Interesting challenge here in Hong Kong. The park was designed to attract visitors from all over the region, not just the Chinese. So people are coming from New Zealand and Australia and even India. So the thinking was, let's give them a very California experience. So the main street is nearly a one-to-one replica. You can see the elevation here. That's Anaheim in 1955 and Hong Kong below. It was uncanny for me as a California native to walk along this ersatz main street. Also, they looked at cultural consultants. So feng shui experts were asked. And the angle of the front gate is 12 degrees to ensure prosperity, as well as this dog leg in the path, which makes sure that the flow of positive qi doesn't slip past the entrance to the park. And the park has extensive gardens designed in the Chinese tradition. There are photo ops for characters throughout, and pagodas and other shrine-like structures. Even the Tomorrowland area has Chinese-influenced architecture. The most recent Disney park to open is Shanghai in 2016. This is the largest park, even larger than the Magic Kingdom in Florida. The castle is massive. So the design challenge here was nearly all the visitors were expected to be Chinese. The company stated that the Shanghai park was designed to be authentically Disney and distinctly Chinese. There's no railroad, curiously, but Walt's device of passing through a tunnel to enter remains. And there's no Main Street USA. The entrance corridor is instead a fantasy collage called Mickey Avenue. You have some generic gingerbread architecture, but also craziness like this. There's a ship built on the top of this toy store. And the gardens are so important to Chinese culture. Here they are their own land, actually replacing the hub at the center of the park. The most extensive landscape architecture of any Disney park. Elaborate mazes, and the Garden of the 12 Friends. Each animal in the Chinese zodiac is represented by a Disney character. Again, these are photo ops designed for social media. So the experience takeaway, human-centered design is audience-focused. Treat those you are designing for more than just human. They are users, visitors, and guests. Be like Walt. Give your guests what they need, what they desire, and most importantly, what they deserve. I'm just going to close right here with an article in the New York Times about a year after Disney World opened. Famed architect Robert Venturi said, Disney World is nearer to what people really want than anything architects have ever given them. Liking the guests means human-centered design first and always. Thank you.